Hello and welcome back to another episode of the EDHRECast. I am Matt Morgan. I'm here. I'm joined with my quarter zip buddy in spirits over there. Dana Roach, what's going on?
Good morning. We're recording this earlier than we usually do, so apparently we managed to get our hair done, but we just put on the quarter zips today. We didn't.
You got to stay cozy in these early morning recordings. Well, Dana, so a couple weeks ago you actually interviewed me, and I figured let's turn the tables around a little bit. Let me interview you about your deck building process, how you like to play Commander. I think it's only fair. You got to do it to me. I want to return fire.
I'm looking forward to talking about me and my devotion to theme when I build decks.
Yeah, you are very devoted to your theme, so I'm going to put on my best Chris Evans and put you under fire. But before we get to that, we have some quick shout-outs we got to do.
We are, first of all, very excited to be members of Team Ultimate Guard. Just simply put, we use their stuff from their sleeves to their deck boxes to their bags, and that makes for an easy partnership. MagicCon Vegas is coming up at the end of October, and Matt and Joey and I will all be there playing games with our decks stylishly protected by Ultimate Guard products, and you'll probably be able to find us over on the Ultimate Guard booth at some point doing a meet and greet and a meet and beat, I guess is what they call it, and playing games there as well. So stop by and say hi to the Ultimate Guard booth, or just find us playing games in general at MagicCon Vegas.
Well, and Dana, I have an event this weekend. I have one of their Vago backpacks. Oh my gosh, it is just the perfect on-site backpack just for everything. You have slots for a binder, your deck boxes, except like if you need a power brick, you have space for all that. I'm kind of blown away by this. Cannot recommend them enough. Talk to your local game store, have them order one for you. I love this thing.
Yeah, it's excellent. I actually used to tease my partner about how many purses she had, and I have become that person with backpacks, and I've just added this to my backpack rotation, and it's excellent.
You're in good company there. But also, if you would like to support the podcast, there's lots of ways that you can do that. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can like this video, subscribe to your local podcast app, leaving a review. All of those are great ways to support the show. We appreciate all of that. And it's just a free way to support the show. But if you are so moved, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see all these episodes a day early before anyone else can. We have patrons that are watching this stuff on Thursdays, not Friday. If you would like that, head to patreon.com/EDHRECast. And if you'd like to be in the running for our coveted weekly patron shout out, you can do that, which is exactly what Luke Sapp did. So Luke, thank you for your contributions to our Patreon. Thank you to your cousin Warren Sapp, who won so many Super Bowls, such a good defensive tackle.
And he also, the first place I went with it was Warren Sapp as well.
Yeah, very dominant on the defensive line. The sports jokes are going to happen because Joey's not here to rein it in. So either way, Luke, thank you for your support. We definitely appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Luke, and thanks for everyone for supporting the show. When you listen to this on your podcast app, give us a like or an upvote. Same thing on YouTube. It means a lot, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, 100%. So with all that out of the way, Dana, I think it's time to talk about you. Everybody loves talking about themselves, so I'm going to give you a shot to do that. So real quick, let's set everything up. So you asked me how I got into Magic, how I got into Commander. So why don't you take us through that journey of when you first got into Magic, what you were doing, because you've been playing significantly longer than the average player.
So I had a friend of mine who was a year older than me, who graduated high school and went off to college. And when he came back the following summer, he was somebody I had played D&D with. When he came back, he brought Magic cards back. He had played in the college he had went to, and we're talking like Antiquities, Arabian Nights,
so
Unlimited.
OG sets.
He came back with OG stuff, like Revised had, I believe, just came out a couple months earlier, and he immediately kind of got us in town, in this small town in Wisconsin, hooked on Magic. And I was actually able to find at a couple of different times Antiquities packs in like game shops. So I have opened back in the day Antiquities packs originally. I think one Unlimited pack I found somewhere, and bought a lot of Revised. That was like the first set I played was Revised.
So that's significantly better than the first packs I opened, where I opened Homelands packs. You got to open Revised. Very, very different barriers as far as who has the bragging rights.
Because I remember us being annoyed at cracking open dual lands. Because like, what do we need these lands for? I want like Mahotmi Jin or something, you know? Shivan Dragon, amazing. I keep cracking Volcanic Islands. This is super annoying. So like
And
that
in
was the
retrospect,
mindset.
That stance does not hold up at all. There's listeners screaming
Yes.
at their phones right now.
Yeah. So that was when I first started playing. And, like competitive Magic was just starting to be a thing. So it was very like much a kitchen table game. And the friend that introduced us, we were playing some 60 card Magic, but he also said there was this thing people do called Highlander.
Okay.
Pre-Elder Dragon Highlander. This was, I think, even before Legends had dropped. But we were so we built giant decks. It wasn't 100 cards. It was just like as many cards as you want to throw in. But there were no repeats. And of course, you're dealing with like revised Arabian Nights Antiquities. So like 3 sets. I mean, it was
very small
pretty
card pool.
limited, in terms of your card pool. But so one of the first decks I had built was for casual play was a no repeat deck. Mm-hmm. And then when Legends came out, we just folded those into the decks. But so like even back in Magic's early days, people were casually playing versions of EDH, and that was one of the first things I started playing on.
Well, there's not very many people out there that can out hipster the rules committee. Gavin, Doug, and Toby, who were kind of playing since the inception of the game.
Sure,
but you're almost matching them. So that well played there.
Well, we had went to Gen Con that summer, the summer that Legends was released, and there was somebody that had mapped packs, and they were selling, like, you could pick what legend you wanted. And they would sell you a pack, and I think it was $10. So you could buy a Legends pack and guarantee what rare legend you wanted. And since my friends and I all had these 3-color no repeat decks, we actually wanted Elder Dragons for our decks. Mm-hmm. So rather than get like a Moat or a Tabernacle or something, like I had gotten a Victus Asmati for my deck, and my friend got a, I think it was Palladium Moors and somebody else. So like we all had different 3-color no repeat decks, and we all got an Elder Dragon for our deck from those mapped packs. Like, Moat?
Get out of here.
We could get an 8-drop dragon with an upkeep.
It's only like an $800 card. Yeah, get out of here.
Right.
I mean, that's wild. It's so funny hearing stories about Commander played back in those days, and I don't mean to date you or anything, but you're the one talking about the timeline. So, but it is so funny because like I remember I was like such a kid. I mean, I was like 12 years old when I was opening these packs, and you being just older, a little more advanced, and just like how you think about everything. It's so funny just to hear like, oh yeah, we wanted those mapped packs because we knew we wanted that legend. We knew we wanted that one card. And mapping packs, for everybody who doesn't remember, was such a debacle. That's why you don't buy any loose packs from those sets back then, because you could actually like predict and know what cards you were going to open in any given pack because of just the printing processes back then. Yeah.
So like the sequence the packs were in the box would tell you what the rare was. And once you figured out, I think you could crack one pack and then you could tell which box sequence it was, So yeah, that was
the Wild West of Magic.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, okay. So you start off playing Highlander, you start off playing, kind of an early version of Commander.
Kind of, yeah.
So you played all the way through, or did you take a break in the between? How did that look like?
I played up through, I think Ice Age was the last thing I had bought. I was in college then, I think it was my freshman year, and I had a roommate of mine basically had a nervous breakdown, and he stole a bunch of stuff from the other roommates.
Oof.
Including my Magic cards, and sold them all at a pawn shop for like $25 or something. So I was just like, I'm not going to play anymore. I'm like not going to recollect all of this stuff. I don't want to have to go, buy that Force of Nature again, or that Nightmare, or that Lord of the Pit, plus all those crappy like, Underground Seas and stuff that I also had in those decks, but like especially that Lord of the Pit, it was like an $8 card or something.
That hurts.
Yeah, so I was just done then. So I think Ice Age was the last thing I bought, and I didn't even engage with Magic at all until basically Return to Ravnica.
Oh wow!
I had So at the same time, I had a coworker that played Magic, and I had told him I used to play, so he was always trying to get me to get back into the game. And then I think I got my first iPad then that had and so I downloaded Duel of the Planeswalkers when I was just looking for games on it.
Oh yeah,
and started playing that. So like at the same time, I had a couple of different like pressure points like encouraging me to get back in. So I started looking at cards, and I think Gate Crash was the first pre-release I went to.
Okay.
Like, well, I'll see what's going on with Magic. So I went to a Gate Crash pre-release. I started looking at stuff roughly Return to Ravnica, but Gate Crash was the first event I think I went to when I came back.
So you and I got back in right around the same time, back-to-back sets. You got Gate Crash. I had Theros, which came out later on in that same year. So we kind of came back to the game at the same time and kind of got to experience the same formats again. So you got back into the game. What were your first Commander decks as we know it? Because you played Highlander, but Commander wasn't really a thing back then. Now that Commander exists in 20X, whatever, I forget the year, what did that look like?
2012, I think this was. So I started playing and was just looking around the LGS at that Gate Crash. And I had been doing some research online, and so I knew Commander was a thing. I'm like, oh, that's just like the game I used to play. So my friend that I worked with, my coworker that played, I asked him if he had played Commander at all. He's like, I bought one of the decks, so we can play that. So I because it was kind of familiar to me from what I had previously played, okay, well, I can build a singleton deck with some kind of a commander versus like how we used to do without one. And like very quickly, just we kind of fell down this hole. He got into it because I did. And we were playing at his house like once or twice a week. But like 1v1 isn't quite the same with Commander. So despite playing with Commander rules, we wanted to get more people. So we went to our LGS, went in and asked if they had a Commander night or anything, and they didn't. So we told the guy, well, we're just going to start showing up on Tuesday nights. And he's like, okay, well, if anybody asks, I'll let them know you're here. And we sat there and played 1v1 in the shop on Tuesday nights for probably 3 or 4 weeks till like somebody else said, hey, I heard you guys are playing Commander. You mind if I sit? And
nice.
I mean, I'm the community in town here that started at that, like usually at the shop now when we play, which is still on Tuesdays, we get 120 to 150 people playing on a Commander night there from that beginning 12 years ago with the two of us.
So you literally took the mantra of be the change you want to see in the world and just execute it. You kind of created. That's awesome. How you got to create kind of the play group and the community locally, which I think a lot of players don't really feel empowered to do. And so you just kind of sat there and like, you didn't do anything special. You just sat there, you played Commander at a place you wanted to play at. And that is super cool. And I'm glad that players are going to be able to see that.
Yeah, and I'm lucky, it's a college town, and like the LGS is nice, so like I was in a right place, right time. That's probably not an alternative for everybody, but yeah, it worked out very nicely for me.
Okay, so Dana, you got into the game, you got the community started, but what was your first actual Commander deck then? I want to know the very first deck that got you hooked on the format. What was that?
The first 2 decks I built at the same time kind of was Glissa the Trader, because I'd always liked Death Touch, or it was pre-keyword Death Touch, but like you had Thicket Basilisk and Cockatrice back in the day, and I always liked that mechanic before it was a keyword. Now it was a keyword. So I'm like, well, maybe I'll build around that. And I had always liked Poison. Thought that was cool back when it was just 1 or 2 cards that had Poison as like a weird alt-win mechanic that was terrible.
And then you had Leeches. Don't forget that.
Yes, yeah. Well, Infect was now a thing at this point in time, so we had actually a few more ways to do poison stuff. So I had built Glissa the Trader, and I built it as a Death Touch deck, and I built Vela the Nightclad, which I still have as an artifact deck now, but I built that as an Infect deck with a plan, the thought being Vela gave stuff Intimidate so I could help poke through the various poison and infect creatures. So I built those 2. Those were my first 2 decks I built at the same time, and I still have them in some variation to this day. Nice.
So those you've kept with you for a while. So what kept you hooked then? Like what about Commander made you want to stick around? And when did that devotion to a certain theme kind of really take its place in your deck building process? Because that's something we kind of know you for.
So professionally, like as a career, I've worked almost my whole life in IT, and not as a developer or someone like creating code. I've always done security, operations kind of stuff, networking primarily. And that isn't the most creative enterprise for the most part. The kind of sarcastic way I refer to it as is I've tended to make like rich people richer is what my daily job consists of.
Okay.
That isn't maybe the most satisfying thing to do in the world. And one of the things I liked about Commander and I liked about brewing thematically was it felt like something creative I was doing in a way that like I don't have a way to do at my day job.
Okay.
So it let me do this fun hobby, and it let me do a hobby that was also one that felt like a creative expression. I could build a deck in a way that was like something that was unique to me and felt personal, and that let me combine a couple things. Let me combine a hobby and let me combine a way to actually like have something that felt satisfying.
Yeah, you said the key word there that I think attracts a lot of players to Commander specifically is the expression and being able to kind of come up with an idea and how do I want to do this? And I know that's one reason that I've stuck around with Commander so much is I don't care how the best way to build a deck is. I want to do things my way. I want to find a way to do this thing, but it make sure it's me and it's me being played out on the cards. And so that is a really good, I'm glad that that's kind of something that's resonated with you too, is that self-expression, being able to get away from everything else and have a little bit of escapism almost. So it's a lot of fun to hear you say that. And so you had said when you and I talked about my deck building process, you kind of imagined me as this Calvin character kind of playing with spaceships and making them crash. Right. Anybody who's seen Always Sunny, you know Charlie Kelly with this big murder board trying to find out who Pepe Sylvia is.
Right. Yeah.
I imagine you, whenever you're building decks, you're looking for your Pepe Sylvia. You're trying to find out what is going to make this deck tick for me. And because you can look at EDHREC, you can look at stats and see what makes a deck good, but you want to make a deck yours. And that's something of the three of us on this show, I think you are more devoted to than any of the other two of us.
Yes, I would say I definitely am. I've been doing that since I first started playing Commander. This was like pre-Scryfall, so you're using Gatherer to like search for cards.
The dark days.
Which was a much rougher way to search for things. Just doing weird searches, trying to find ways to find those cards to have enough cards in a deck. Like I'm running some pretty bad cards, particularly back in those early days. Doing searches on Gatherer to find the Viridian Longbows of the world because I hadn't played during those sets, so I didn't have any memory of like, oh, this card would be good for this deck. I hadn't. I missed 95% of the Magic sets that had been released till that point. So I'm having to do searches to find this stuff.
Yeah, I don't think players truly appreciate how dark and rough those days were pre-Scryfall. If you've been in the game for the past like 3 or 4 years, you've kind of always had Scryfall. Finding cards was so difficult because Gather was just such a like terrible website. And I feel bad saying that, but it truly, it was so hard to find cards. And so I don't know if Scryfall didn't exist today, I don't know that players would be able to find near as many cards, especially if you're just getting into the game. The card pool is so overwhelming. Oh, yeah. I don't know how we did it. And we had half the cards to work with.
Right. The card pool has more than doubled since we started playing, 10 years ago.
Yeah. So it's, you're taking me back, Dana. So, so one thing also, so we talked about how you're super devoted to the theme of the deck. One thing you're also super devoted about is picking your commanders. You've said on the show many times how you lament trying to build a popular, quote, commander.
Sure.
So what does that process look like for you? When you're trying to find something hidden or something off the beaten path, how do you start? Do you start with a Scryfall search? Do you look at maybe a set page and find out what commanders aren't being played? Where does that even start for you?
The first thing I do is I just don't build any commander that's probably newer than 2 years old. Okay. Just to give things time to settle in. Like, even if I see something that catches my eye, my usual thought is I'm just going to wait and see where things go here before I decide to build this deck. And I know that's stupid. Other people building a deck shouldn't impact how much I enjoy it, but it does. And I've just accepted the fact that that's how my brain works. And if I see a bunch of people playing the same commander, it makes it not exciting for me to play. So just because of that's just how I am. I just don't touch anything until it's had a little bit of time to sit for a while. Beyond that, though, usually I don't usually see a commander and then think I want to build this. Usually I have an idea and then I try to find a commander that lets me use that idea. A couple of years back when I built a fling deck, I'm like, I like the idea. Okay, I want to build a deck where I'm going to fling creatures at people.
Yeah.
So what commander then can enable that? And I originally built it as Kresh Bloodbraided because Kresh was pretty old. Not a lot of people were playing Kresh anymore. had the colors of things I wanted. I wanted to have green and red, and there's some effects in black that kind of do that too.
Yeah.
And then because of how Kresh works, he gets counters when creatures are killed. It's like, oh, well, if I fling something, then Kresh gets even bigger, and then I can fling Kresh. So that makes sense in terms of how I want to build the deck. And then because Kresh interacts with +1 counters, maybe I could have a +1 counter sub theme. So that gives me another theme in the deck, another thing to like narrow down what cards I'm going to choose. That way I don't have like this infinite card pool. So
sure.
That's just that's kind of in a nutshell how I like look at this stuff when I get an idea to build a deck.
Well, and Dana, you said people don't build Kresh anymore. Kresh was one of the OGs because back when Kresh was first printed, that had 3 colors, and you just didn't really have access to that outside of the original Elder Dragons. Yeah. Seeing Kresh fall off, it's kind of like Rafiq,
right?
Where Rafiq used to be the monster of the format, and people who played back then. I say Rafiq and you're like, oh, screw that guy. Like, it's so funny because these days you play Rafiq and nobody cares. You play Kresh and people are like, why?
Yeah.
Like you could play Corvold instead.
Yeah. If they released Rafiq right now in a set, no one would look. People are like, oh, that's interesting. And then they would stop talking about it 10 seconds later. It would just be forgotten.
Yep. There's not enough text on Rafiq for people to talk about. So that's why they would move on from it pretty quickly. So, okay. So you're pretty selective about you building your decks. What does the process look like when you're choosing a deck to take apart? Because you want things to play out pretty specifically. Like when you have a deck in mind, what does that process look like when you're so picky about choosing a commander and then deciding to take a deck apart after that?
So the 2 most recent ones I've taken apart, in terms of like decks I've had long term, I've definitely made some that I tried and then like after a month or 2, like this just is not fun for whatever reason. But for long term decks, I had a Sigarda, Host of Hurons Enchantress deck and Jury, Master of the Review deck that was not really a fling deck, but like sacrifice Jury to deal damage and you put the counters on him. It was primarily a treasures deck.
Okay.
The reasons those 2 I took apart, I felt like the Enchantress deck, there was too many tools. I think the last straw was one of the Enchantress-ish effects we got in Neon Dynasty. It was a mono white legend. I don't remember what the name of it even is. People are yelling at the at the podcast right now because I've forgotten.
Joey will be able to pull it up, put it on the screen for us.
Yeah, but like at that point, I felt like, at this point, there's so many ways to draw cards in Enchantress deck. It wasn't interesting or a challenge anymore for me to play. It just wasn't fun. And the same thing with that Jury deck. I built Jury, and I think at that point there had been Ixalan sets that had treasures and one of the Forgotten Realms sets that had treasures for the most part. So like again, I was running, when I first built it, I was running some pretty bad common creatures that like made a treasure on ETB or made treasure on attack or whatever to have enough things that made treasures in the deck to get it to do the thing it did. And then over the course of like the next year, we got so many different things that made treasures that again, it felt like the deck, I didn't have to really work at it. There wasn't a challenge to get it to do the thing I wanted it to do. And it just wasn't fun then at that point anymore.
Sure.
So both those decks were ones I took apart because what made them interesting no longer felt interesting.
I totally get that. You wanted to make sure that something was still appealing to you, something that was still standing out in some sort of way. So when it loses its interest, I think players might take a page from your book even, because I think sometimes players, especially when we're talking to patrons, a lot of times like, I want to rework it. It's okay to give up on a deck idea. Sometimes things just don't work out. I know that maybe I'm a little too attached to decks because I talk a lot lately, especially about how I have just too many decks. I have 20 decks now. I don't play enough to cycle through 20 decks. And sometimes I'm just like, I want to play the decks I want to play. And sometimes that means like maybe 5 decks. So I really admire your willingness to just admit to yourself, like, the deck has run its course.
Sure.
It was, you don't have to say, oh, this was a stupid deck. It was a bad deck. But sometimes it runs its course. Like relationships sometimes run their course. And it's time to call it quits. That applies to your decks too, people.
Absolutely. Right. Just because it didn't last forever doesn't mean it was a failure. It was just like something you built that was fun for a little while and then was no longer fun, and that's perfectly okay. And you can move on to trying something else or trying to find a way to make it work. For example, I took that Enchantress deck apart and I'm like, well, I kind of want a deck that primarily focuses on enchantments as a win condition. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe half of a Selesnya deck will be fine. So I switched to Thrun, the original Thrun, the last troll deck. Because I'm like, okay, well, it protects itself if you're putting a bunch of auras on it, and I'm not, I'm down to a single color. Well, it turns out that really wasn't much of a change. I still had access to most of the stuff that mattered, and it kind of played the same way. So then I wound up building Caliphate, because that was my, let's try the same thing on mono blue, where I don't have access to all of the things that make auras and enchantments good in green and or white. Now, we did just get a Enchantress in mono blue spoiled.
Literally, as we're saying that, preview season is going on for Duskmourn when we're recording. We just got a Duskmourn Enchantress card, so rip to your Khalifi deck, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it probably won't be frustrating until there's like 6 of them or something, so I guess 1 I'm okay for now. But yeah, so it's like that, the concept I stuck with and eventually, found another deck for it. And I probably won't do something with treasures again, but like I'm always looking for something that catches my eye in the Rakdos space too. Sure. So I'll eventually put another Rakdos deck back together, but I have to find something that an idea that interests me more so than necessarily a commander. So
do you think, now that, like we said, there's a blue Enchantress that's coming out in Duskmourn, so it's going to let you draw cards whenever you cast enchantments in your Khalifi deck. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's going to discourage you? Like, you wanted to go off the beaten path, and I know you well enough to know you don't want things to be too easy. If that trend continues, will that discourage you from playing this deck more often? Do you think it might just force you to take it apart if they keep giving tools to it?
It would. I don't know what the density of those things would have to be before it gets becomes not fun, or feels the point where oh, this is too easy. Sure. There's no challenge in this. It feels real obvious. It's not one Enchantress, but yes, at some point definitely it would happen. Because it didn't feel that way when I first had that Sigarda deck together too. Because there was, at the time, 4 or 5 of those effects, and I had to scramble to get to the point where I had one out, then I could start the engine going, and it felt like I had to work to get there. Whereas at this point, when we've got a dozen or 15 different variants on that effect in Selesnya colors, I felt like it was just too easy to get the engine started.
Sure, that makes sense.
And I might get to that point in mono blue, who knows? But I'm not there yet, at least. So I think I'm okay for the near future.
So do you think that you're going to put that card in then too? So
I might as well try it. Yeah, I'll put it in there.
Because I think that there is some sort of pressure, just because you're doing something specific doesn't mean you're going to do it poorly. Right. And drawing cards is always good. I know that you love drawing cards. Yes. Do you think you're going to put the deck in, or put the card in the deck? Or do you think you're going to be stubborn and refuse to play it?
I'll put it in there because that's also a weird thing, right? I want to build on a theme, and I want to build something unique to me, but also I don't want to just not run stuff that's available and obvious. Mm-hmm. That's also a strange thing, or I'm just going to stubbornly not run this card that's a really obvious solid include in this deck. Yeah. That would also bug me, because I feel why am I brewing if I'm brewing badly? Yeah.
I totally get that, and I can appreciate that. So, well, let's get to challenge stats. I want to pick your brain about this original deck that you have, because it turned in from 1 deck to 4 decks now. Right. I want to talk about this suite of Glissa decks that you have. But let's challenge the stats real quick, and then we'll get into it.
All right.
So I'll get us started off then real quick. And so Robert Vicenia, and I hope I'm saying that right, sent us an email, which anyone can do, EDHRECast@gmail.com. But Robert sent us an email that had a really good challenge, and it's a super simple one. It's straightforward, and I think it's going to rise in popularity the more people catch on to this. So Robert said, I have a challenge for the commander, Mirko Obsessive Theorist. The card is Heartless Act. And so, real quick, Mirko is that Dimir legend that came out in the Murders at Karlov Manor with 1/3 flying vigilance. Whenever you surveil, you put a +1/+1 counter on Mirko Obsessive Theorist. And at the beginning of your end step, you may return target creature card with power less than Mirko's from the graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. And so the card Heartless Act, a lot of people think of it as removal and in ways to get rid of things, but there's a lot of flexibility here. Heartless Act is 1 in a black for an instant, says choose one. You can destroy target creature with no counters on it, or you can remove up to 3 counters from target creature. Astute listeners are picking up on what Robert was letting us know about. Heartless Act can be removal, but also can remove finality counters from creatures reanimated with Mirko, and it's currently only showing up on 145 decks of the over 4,400 that are being built for Mirko. This is a super, super good call. So I looked at commanders that are playing finality counters or playing around with that. There's not a ton of them right now because they're fairly recently added to the game. But as more different counters like finality counters come into play where you don't actually want them on your creatures, Heartless Act is just going to keep getting better and better. If you're playing something like the new Admiral Brass Unsinkable, that's another one that's going to bring creatures back, bring pirates back with finality counters on them. If you want ways to make sure they're not going to get exiled because they're kind of key to your strategy or anything like that, Heartless Act is such a great way to make sure they're going back into the graveyard so you can keep removing them and go looping everything, basically. I like this a lot. I think Shil Gengar from the new Modern Horizons set would like this a lot. Winter Cynical Opportunist. There's a lot of really, really cool designs out there that are putting finality counters on your creatures. If you want to save them, make sure that they're not actually leaving the game. You have to wish them back. However, play Heartless Act. This is such a really, really good catch. So, thank you, Robert, for this email. Thank you for the really good challenge. Keep an eye out on Heartless Act, folks, especially if you're playing around with finality counters.
Well, my challenge this week is for a card that's a little bit old at this point. It shouldn't be a surprise. But it hasn't had a reprint either. It was originally printed in Ravnica, City of Guilds, and that's Concerted Effort.
Okay.
Concerted Effort is an enchantment, 2 and a double white, so 4 mana total. And it just says, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, creatures you control gain flying until the end of turn if a creature you control has flying. And the same is true for Fear, First Strike, Double Strike, Land Walk, Protection, Trample, and Vigilance. So kind of similar to how Odric Master Tactician works. Concerted Effort right now is in just about 3,500 decks in EDHREC, and I'm going to guess one of the reasons for that is because it's only had that reprint, or already had that one printing, 15 years ago. I think most folks just don't know it even exists. And I've had this dropped on me, I think, probably twice in the last year and a half-ish. I think both times in a soldier deck, and both times it kind of won the game. It went from a situation where like the person had, a handful of soldiers that did different things and weren't really a threat, to suddenly a handful of soldiers that all had flying and double strike and, vigilance and trample, because each individual soldier had one of those abilities. This probably isn't a card that gets just jammed into any old creature-based deck because, for example, I have a Selesnya Dragons deck. Well, all those dragons tend to already have flying, and a lot of them already have trample, and they don't have much else in terms of keywords, so it doesn't do much good there. But if you're in something like a soldier deck, for example, where there's a lot of different keywords scattered around those creatures, being able to drop a 4-mana enchantment and have all of them have all of the keywords is game-changing, and there's definitely more than 3,500 decks out there that want Concerted Effort. So if you are playing something in white that has a lot of bodies and there tends to be just random keywords floating around, take a look at Concerted Effort. It can just absolutely change the face of the game if you play it.
Yeah, I love that challenge. I think it would have fit more maybe in the episode where you interviewed me about combat, because this is really good if you like turning creatures sideways.
Good point. Absolutely.
It's kind of an Odric style
for sure.
ability there. So if you need a backup Odric effect, this is a really good way to spread it around.
Yeah.
All right, Dana. So I hinted before we got into Challenger Stats that I want to hear about this suite of Glissa decks, because you mentioned Glissa the Trader was a commander deck that kind of got you playing the game. But looking at your list of commander decks on Archidekt, you have not just one, but 4 Glissa decks. One for every iteration. You have Glissa Sunseeker, you have Glissa Sunslayer, you have Glissa the Trader, and then, of course, Glissa Herald of Predation. How did this come about? Because most people don't build 4 decks for one character unless they're like very, very into the character.
So I originally built Glissa the Trader as a Death Touch deck, and we talked about that. Mm-hmm. One of the problems, and I know on an earlier show we talked about this back in, I think, even pre-YouTube days this was. One of the problems with that deck was I was fighting 2 different themes that didn't necessarily work together.
Yep.
I had all these Death Touch creatures. I wanted to do things that took advantage of that. But Glissa herself has an ability that when a creature an opponent controls dies, you can bring an artifact back from your graveyard to play. Or excuse me, to your hand. And there was a little bit of overlap between those 2 things. Death Touch creatures. So I put a lure effect on something and kill, a bunch of creatures when it swings in. Then I can bring some artifacts back. But by and large, those 2 themes kind of fought against each other for room in the deck. So when Glissa Sunslayer came out, it was another Glissa card, and it had Death Touch. It has other abilities that are useful that aren't necessarily fighting against the deck in terms of recurring artifacts, so maybe I'll turn my Death Touch deck into a Glissa Sunslayer deck. Which didn't require much changes other than just moving everything over and pulling out a few of the artifacts I was recurring, like Mishra's Bauble as a draw effect or Executioner's Capsule as a repeatable way to kill stuff.
Yep.
But I still had the shell of that artifact recursion deck from Glissa the Trader. And I'm like, well, maybe I will just then lean into that artifact recursion theme. And the thing I will do to, kind of put a specific theme in the deck is I'll just run all artifact creatures. So that way, when the Wormcoil Engine dies or something, and I make the 2 Wormcoil Engine tokens, well, then when something else dies, I can bring the Wormcoil Engine back and recast it. So I decided to run a bunch of, that's the rule for that deck, that theme is it's all artifact creatures that get recurred with Glissa.
Yeah.
And I'd always liked Glissa as a character once I built the deck primarily because First Strike Death Touch originally, but having built a deck, I did some lore reading. I'm like, oh, I actually like the character then. And at this point, I have 2 Glissa decks. Then they released Herald of Predation. And I'm like, well, maybe, okay, it would be, I've got 2. It would be funny to build a third. And then I might as well build the original Glissa too, the mono green one, because why not?
Yeah. So it made a lot of sense to kind of split out the first Glissa the Trader deck into those 2. Yeah. Like you said, why not? So,
right.
And it is fun because sometimes you and I actually both had a Glissa the Trader deck at the same time and both had the same struggles where, well, it's trying to do one thing, but it's actually doing another. It's kind of split, and you were significantly more devoted to making it work than I was. I was trying to do it as kind of an Eldrazi type of thing, cheating out a bunch of like colorless mana with stuff like Kark Clan Ironworks. And so sacrificing a bunch of artifact stuff that way did not work. You were much more successful in how you executed that.
At least in terms of what the specific thing that was trying to do, it did work a little bit better than I think your version of it. Because there's probably also better ways to make an Eldrazi deck too. You were that also winds up being frustrating sometimes, where you're like,
100%.
I'm walking to school uphill both ways. That seems unnecessary.
I very much was. Yeah. There was a reason that this deck doesn't exist for me anymore, but I'm glad that you were able to take the one deck and eventually turn it into 4. So of the 4 that you have, which one was the hardest to get together?
Mono green Glissa was the trickiest. Trying to figure out what I was going to do for a theme. I believe we talked about it on here a couple months ago. It might have been just Joey and I, where like just destroying people's artifacts is a thing Glissa does. You can tap her to blow up an artifact whose mana value is equal to the amount of mana in your pool, but you don't spend the mana. So like you float, 4 mana, tap Glissa, blow up a 4 mana artifact of some sort, and then use the mana presumably for something else.
Yep.
But that doesn't necessarily lend itself to like a specific way to build a deck. Yes, that's a useful utility, but like, what am I going to do beyond that? What I eventually settled on was I mentioned one of my first decks was trying to build poison/infect, and I'd always liked the idea, but never figured out how to make it work. Like, well, why don't I just do that? Since Glissa eventually like becomes a Phyrexian anyway. This could be my mono green version of Infect, and I felt like that was a pretty low-powered version of Infect, was having in the Glissa deck, and then because of her ability to destroy artifacts, I can run a bunch of stuff that turns other things into artifacts to remove blockers from that might be keeping me from poking through with my Infect stuff. So I can turn my opponent's blockers into artifacts, knock them out, and then swing through with the various poison or Infect or toxic creatures that I have in the deck.
Yeah.
So that one took the longest to figure out how to make it a specific way.
Yeah. I mean, you have cards like Liquid Metal Coating, Liquid Metal Torque. So there's lots of ways to make things artifacts. And I'm looking at the deck right now, and you have even cards like Hilda's Crown of Winter. If you're not destroying them, you're at least getting them out of the way to make room for your small little creatures.
Yeah.
So I like how you kind of were able to process through that. And and Glissa Sunsleeker, it makes sense flavorfully too that is your Infect deck, because Mirrodin had all the Infect things going on there. That's kind of how the Mirrodin Besieged came around. So flavorfully, you found a way to execute it too. So that is fun to see how this all came together. It played out, and you kind of took a challenge and, well, how can I make this work? Still in all the restrictions you put on yourself.
Right. Yeah. Because in this case, I've limited the creatures in the deck. They have to have some way to generate poison. So that gave me a kind of a way to build the deck. Like, because I like to have some kind of a rule that limits So I'm not just throwing in random good creatures. You know, I think I've mentioned this before, but like one of the reasons I originally built a Sphinx deck was I wanted to run Consecrated Sphinx for a reason beyond it's really good. Like it gave me a way to be like, well, it's a Sphinx deck. Of course I'm running Consecrated Sphinx.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you found some way to like justify running one of them, like the banes of the format for a little bit too. So kudos for you. So, okay. So one thing that I have noticed about you and the way that you play the game, not necessarily build decks, but the way that you play the actual games themselves, is you spend a lot of time waiting for your moment to pounce. How do you calculate the timing of when to deploy your business cards, and how does that kind of vary from deck to deck? Like, when do you piece that together of, okay, this is the turn that the deck is going to spring into action?
One of the things I tend to do very consciously is I wait to play something that's a threat until I feel like there's a larger threat already in play. So I don't want to drop this Parallel Lives, for example, until someone else plays a Doubling Season.
Okay.
Unless there's something on my board that makes my board state much scarier than the person with Doubling Season. If someone's going to aim removal at something, my thing will probably not be that thing. Yep. And that's one of the things I tend to look for when I am playing whatever in a game is there something else out there that's going to be the target ahead of the thing I'm about to do? And if there's not, I usually don't do it.
So that is just, it's so funny because you and I butt heads on this so much. You say you wait till a threat is bigger than something so you can play something a little, just a little bit smaller.
Sure.
I say I'll see your 7-drop and raise you an 8-drop, and the exact opposite of, oh no, I won't be outdone. I'm going to have the scariest thing on the board.
That's fun for you too, though, right? Like you enjoy that aspect. It 100%
is fun. I love that. For me, it's all about like we're playing Commander. Let's do the big dumb stuff, and I will not be out big dumb stuffed.
Sure, absolutely. No, I get that. You probably, generally speaking, too, like, I'll just always like having fun. Whereas, like, I tend to, not that I'm not having fun, but like, I'm going to not have as much fun for a turn because it's strategically more valuable to not do so.
You're going to analyze when you can have the fun, whereas I'm just full bore ahead. It is so funny because we play games fairly often, and say that there's, a couple of the people at the table. Yeah. I'll play something scary and you play something just a little less scary, and everybody still is worried about my thing. I'm like, no, but Dana's is going to be scary too. Like, give it a turn.
Right.
And it's funny because I like to say, if people haven't figured out what you're doing, by the time they do figure it out, it is too late. You have already like sunk your claws into the game. And when Dana, finally decides to kind of turn the corner and pounce, like the game is going to be effectively over very quickly.
Well, and some of it is necessity as well. I think if you are, we always pick on Corval and Tulane because we just always have. But if you are playing Tulane as your commander, it does so many things for you, and it does those things as a reward for doing the thing you were already doing anyway. You can afford to make mistakes, I think, because that commander just rewards you so much for so many things you're already doing. You can play pretty loose with a commander like Tulane or Corvald or any really popular strong commander. When you're playing Glissa Sunseeker, you can't really afford to like be sloppy with what you're doing, particularly if you're playing with a really rigid theme in that deck. Like you just have to pick your moments if you want to win games and have to be very cautious about those kind of things, or you're going to get slapped around by the commander that rewards you just for casting it.
Your opportunities are definitely going to be few and far between.
Yeah.
When if you're not quite kneecapping, but you're a little more intentional about going off the beaten path with your commander. I 100% agree with you there. It's just, it's something that I've always thought is kind of funny is you and I have just starkly different approaches when it comes to when we deploy our threats.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ooh and ah the table. You want to, ooh, you didn't see that coming, did you?
Yeah. And actually that kind of caused a problem a couple weeks ago. I was playing at my LGS and I played with a couple of younger players. They were probably high school kids who I hadn't played with before. And they were like relatively new. They'd played for a couple of years, I would guess. And I tend to play like older cards too. And they were absolutely convinced my decks were not a threat. I'm trying to like point out like what, just because you haven't seen these cards doesn't mean they're not a problem. I was trying to like, no guys, you probably should be aiming at me right now because of this. And I was trying to like nudge them in the direction of what was going to happen. And then, and they refused to participate. They were like, nope, my buddy over there is the threat. I'm taking him out, and they hit him. And then like, next turn I kill everybody or something. So yeah, that can, if you're not a player who plays a lot and you haven't seen some of these cards, or you're not, that can be a challenge for sure.
It is just very, very funny, and it's easy to kind of slip under the cracks. I've just gotten in the habit of, if you play a card, I can't let you untap with it because I don't trust you.
Sure. Sure.
I don't trust you not to kill us with those random uncommons.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that's when you play a lot of Commander, you start to learn that kind of stuff too. Like that's when we did the show talking about win percentages last year, that's, I think, one of the things that's really difficult to gauge in terms of deck power and stuff like that is when you play as much as we play, or as talk about Commander as much as we talk about, that just wins you games. Like that just gives you an edge a lot of times.
We are significantly more invested than the typical player, just because, I mean, doing this show for 6 years at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, we're kind of thinking about Commander quite a bit and evaluating cards all the time. When you're exposed just to that much information, it does help just having that knowledge base 100%.
And that's the thing too, like, because of that, I can brew Caliphate as a deck and have it be very, very effective. I understand why most people don't brew the way I do. It's a lot of work if you don't spend the amount of time that we spend on it.
It takes forever to build those murder boards. Yeah, I know.
Absolutely. Right, for sure.
Yeah.
I have no expectations for other people to brew the way I brew or build the way I build, because that's just not the way most people engage with this game. It's fun for me. Most people just want to like pick up a deck and play.
Yep. And I mean, I'm 100% in that category. And that's probably why I shouldn't record my win percentage, because it's probably pretty low because of the aforementioned problems of, I'm just going to draw all the attention to me so that I kind of get whacked out of the game pretty easily and early. I will admit that problem. But I mean, that's just kind of comes to show the appeal of Commander. It's going to hit the people that want to approach it very cerebrally like you do, people like me that just want to charge forward and just play the things and do what they want to do. So it is kind of a testament to Commander itself that you and I approach the game very, very differently, but we still are playing the same format. We're still playing games together, and it kind of brings everyone together. So I do like that kind of narrative and that picture that we're painting there. So my last question for you then, before we take off, is you've never ended a game with too many cards in your hand. I believe I'm quoting you on this.
Absolutely.
You love paying life to draw those cards.
Yeah.
So take me through the colors. So we'll go Wooburg. What do the different colors do to influence your card draw suites? Because you always seem to have answers in your hands. You always seem to have a ton of cards in hand, but every color does it differently. So let's start off with white. What does white do? How does it help kind of influence your card draw?
So white is probably the weakest of these, although it's gotten better in recent years. Traditionally, white's draw was always tied to creatures. We've gotten a few more effects. I actually kind of like 3 knocks. It's kind of a Phyrexian Arena effect in white that goes away after a couple turns, but like being able to draw cards for 3 or 4 turns is pretty good. You don't need to have it for 10 necessarily. There's a couple different effects. Chivalric Alliance. I'm saying that probably incorrectly.
Chivalric,
when you tackle 2 or more creatures, you can draw a card. It's relatively efficient too. There's enough of those effects now. Trouble in Pairs is a really good one.
Trouble in Pairs. Dawn of a New Age, I really like.
Yeah. Dawn of a New Age is really good too. So white's gotten kind of, it's still probably the weakest in terms of card draw, but white's gotten better ones, particularly if you are willing to do creature combat or swing stuff sideways. But it's a deck where you have to be the most creative probably too to find ways to draw cards, I would say, or use really suboptimal methods. So like my mono white deck is probably the one that draws cards the worst, but you gotta do what you gotta do to put cards in hand in white. So white's the weakest. Red's gotten so much better though. Like even in the early days of the show, we talked about how bad Boros was at drawing cards. Red's just gotten really good.
Yes, it has.
And one of my favorite things, I like really efficient card draw. I'm perfectly okay spending 2 mana to draw 2 cards. Knight's Whisper is one of my favorite cards ever. And red at this point has gotten a handful of impulse draw versions of that, the kind of Ren's Resolve kind of cards, where you impulse draw 2 until your next turn. Like that's probably going to hit your land drop and give you something else useful. So that's the first thing. If I'm playing red, I'm going to throw a handful of those like small impulse kind of draw effects in there. And whatever the newest, greatest version of Outpost Siege is, there's so many of those now that give you a repeatable impulse draw as well.
Do you remember when Outpost Siege was the only red version in that category? Like you, if you're playing red, you kind of had to play it because that was your only option.
Like literally when I saw that card, I'm like, well, this is just going to go in every red deck I ever make.
Yeah.
Right? I was just sure.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. And very quickly it got power crept out with different versions, and there's a bunch of different, ways to do the same thing. So, but yeah, red's gotten so much better. The only thing I think the downside is you don't want to stack too much impulse draw. Like if you cast 4 blue draw spells in a turn, you just draw cards off each of them. If you cast 4 impulse draw spells in a turn, you're limited with how much mana you have that you can utilize those cards.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like those, particularly the small efficient ones in red.
I saw somebody cast Embrace the Unknown, which was from the Outlaws of Thunder Junction precons. That card was super rad. It's Impulse 2, but then you get to retracing. That is a great way to set yourself up for some really, really good turns over the course of the game. And we kind of talk all day about the powers of red impulse draw. It's such a good thing to add in your decks, people.
And it, all at the same time, feels like flavorful for red. You could have just given red more plain old card draw, but like having it be tied to you have to use it this turn feels red. I think it just was a really elegant solution to solve a lot of problems in that color. In black, I kind of play the same way, but with the Sign in Bloods and the Read the Bones of the world.
That's your bread and butter. There you go.
Yeah, just the little stuff. I like to then have some bigger draw effects in there too, but like I think people really undervalue the inexpensive draw you 2 cards for 2 mana effects, both in black and in red and blue. Blue's got a handful of them too over the years. Stuff like Winged Words or Chart a Course, things that almost always in the right deck cost 2 mana, draw you 2 cards.
Yeah.
Like that smooths out so much stuff at every point in the game.
Yeah, Knight's Whisper, the rate of 2 mana to draw 2 cards, like you're netting a card. There's a lot to like about those, and why this category is so important to you is filling out those veggie cards. It's stuff that it's not glamorous to put in a deck, but you need them to make your deck work.
Right, yes. And they get you to those things. Like they fill in. They make everything just in your deck just work so much more smoothly. Not that I don't love drawing like 9 cards off of Rishkar's Expertise or something, because that feels great.
Which I do.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the kind of things I tend to run in green. But you have to get there, get to the point in the game to be able to cast those, which is why in a Golgari deck, I tend to run a bunch of like black's efficient draw, and then a bunch of greens like home run draw. Use the cheap black life pay draw to get to that point, and then use the big Rishkar's Expertise or Turn of the Wild Speaker to draw all of the cards.
Yeah, we get it. You're making me feel bad. I get it, Dana. You need to find balance. It can't all be Rishkar's Expertises.
But in a general sense, like we've joked about it on the show in the past. Like if my deck isn't working great, add more draw. That's like my response to everything. I feel like whenever I have a problem with a deck, I feel like you can solve that problem most of the time by just putting in a little more card draw.
Just draw a few more cards. You'll get to those power cards more often. Sure, I get it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so real quick, you said green does the big, powerful, flashy draw. What is that kind of that veggie type of draw though in green that you like to go to? I know you like Sylvan Library, but Sylvan Library is like a $60 card.
Right. And I think that's probably green's weakest. It tends to really struggle with like the small efficient draw. Yeah, there's a few of the Elvish Visionary kind of effects where you
harmonize,
you cantrip 1. Yeah, if you're playing mono green, draw to get you to that point where you can cast the big splashy draw spells. For me, green's probably the one I struggle with the most to find those little things to get me to that point.
Don't tell Wizards designers that green is weak at anything, because you're going to give them a challenge. They're gonna break the color pie and give like harmony, and it's going to be 2 mana, draw 2 cards, and it's going to be in every green deck ever. So
a couple of things I have had kind of good luck with in mono green in particular. I like Compost. Did a challenge of stats on it years ago, 1 in a green for an enchantment. Whenever a black card is put into an opponent's graveyard, you may draw a card. Occasionally you'll get a game where no one's playing black, but like very infrequently has that ever been the issue. And there's been plenty of games where that 2 mana enchantment has drawn me, 10 cards.
Yeah.
So that's one that's pretty efficient that I've had good luck with. It's kind of green's not great version of Rhystic Study a little bit. So there are a few things in green that you can take advantage of. Viridian Revel we talk about in terms of like anti-treasure attack, but I'm running that in my mono green Glissa Sunseeker deck number 1 because she destroys artifacts. But like even more than that, treasures, like it just draws me cards off treasure. So there's a few things like that in green.
Yeah, green at least you can rely on what Commander is like in 2024.
Right.
Talked about Compost.
Yeah.
It's only gotten better. Yeah, I 100% agree. So, well, with that out of the way then, I don't have anything else for you. So unless there's anything you want to say before we go, let's get out of here.
I think the only thing I would say kind of in summary here is I don't think everyone needs to maybe brew the way I do, but I do think it's a fun challenge to try one time Try to build a deck built around, the vigilance keyword or something. Like, it's going to make you dig deeper into the card pool in a way that you probably don't have to usually do. And it's going to make you maybe have to play a little bit tighter than you usually do to have that deck with those restrictions be able to compete. I think that's useful.
Yeah. It definitely is a different kind of challenge, and I'm curious what people would come up with if they kind of took your approach to deck building versus their typical one. I know that I've tried it before, and even just going through the process, I was able to learn a lot about how to use Scryfall better, how to kind of dig into the different keywords and find support for them. So I do appreciate that as a good challenge to our listeners and a final taking home point. So with that said, let's sign off here. So Dana, before we go, where can everybody find you on social media if they want more of you?
Yeah, you can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And you can find Joey at Joseph M. Schultz on Twitter, on pretty much any social media platform as well. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. So if you would like some of the best deck building accessories out there, protect your cards, Ultimate Guard is the best way to do it. I mean, they are the ultimate way to guard your cards. So with that said, it's good to have everybody here. Dana, it was good getting to chat with you again, getting to notice about the turntables, how they've turned around a little bit. But yeah, it was good getting to chat with you. But until then, everybody, let us know kind of what you think. Do you like Dana's approach? Do you have your own specific approach that you are unique to in your playgroup? Let us know in the comments below. But until next week, everybody, don't forget to EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.